let's talk about what happens when entrepreneurs don't show up for a difficult conversation. So that's a good transition there into a conversation I've heard from different entrepreneurs about asset protection trust versus prenups. And I've seen this multiple times now where some entrepreneurs don't want to have a difficult conversation with, generally tends to be a second or third spouse, generally not a first spouse, but they'd rather, in a way, lawyer up instead of having a conversation about a prenup. And so just to set the stage here, I think that there's some emotional discomfort when you lean into a conversation ahead of a marriage that's like, hey, maybe we should talk about having a prenup, because it can be construed as, oh, you're expecting this marriage to fail. And I think that's a block that some will overcome. But there's also a business planning angle of this, an asset protection angle of this versus just marriage planning. And so again, I've heard multiple entrepreneurs that say, hey, how about I just don't have that conversation, and then maybe we just create some asset protection trust or move some assets around to protect me in a different way. So what are your gut thoughts?
Well, the first thing is Mimi, we've been married for 33 years, and I like to tell her that, I should have had her sign a prenup. And she goes, we were both broke. And I go, no, you were negative broke, because she had debt. So if I would have, done the prenup, maybe I wouldn't be responsible for her debt. The truth is about prenups and asset protection trust, sometimes the answer might be both. Mm-hmm. But what I tell entrepreneurs about this prenup conversation is they usually have it too late. Mm-hmm. And I say that the time to have a conversation with someone you're dating about potential prenup agreement in the future, and we should say a prenuptial agreement is an agreement before you get married, mm-hmm. so that the assets that you bring to the marriage are yours. If you get divorced, of course, things you create together, those can be split. But what you bring to the marriage, you get to take with you when you go, so that you don't have a spouse taking what you built without that spouse. That's kind of the idea, right? So the time to have that conversation, I jokingly say second date. First date would be weird. Second date. If you do it at the second date, and the way you bring it up is not, I want to marry you, but, if I ever got married again, I would sign a prenup for the other person, have them sign a prenup, and just tell them like how you're thinking about things. And if you do that very early in the dating space in a way that's not creepy, then that person, you're going to find out right away. If that's a person that's probably a long-term relationship person, they're going to go, hey, I don't care about your money. I'm with you because of you.
Yeah.
And that's how you introduce it early. If you wait until you're about to get married or about to ask the person to marry them, then it comes out of the blue and it seems like you are betting on the marriage failing. So that'd be the first thing I'd say is you need to bring that up very early in any kind of relationship that you might think it might get serious, rather than waiting until it gets serious and expecting that's not going to create a problem.
Yeah. Well, I think too, as a successful entrepreneur, then if you're unable to have a conversation about the prenup, I think that could be a precursor to bigger communication issues that are in your marriage.
Definitely.
And so I think that someone who sees and respects what you are working on, what you're building, and they want you to be successful, there's going to be a lot of trade-offs that happen within that marriage anyways, because being a business owner is not a 20, 30, 40-hour a week job. I mean, it's constant, nonstop, as you and I know. And so I think that the right partner should support you in all the different ways. And I think protecting your life's work should be expected. If both spouses are bringing in some assets, or even one spouse is bringing in assets, create a separate property revocable trust. So that way it's very clear all of the premarital assets go into these separate trusts. There's no inherent asset protection. Name those trusts in the prenup, right? Not to be touched. And then once you get married, you have a joint trust, or you can, commingle assets in whatever way you want. And then that's what would get split, however you kind of decide. But I think that's a very easy, practical way to keep everything segregated. And then that way it's very clear. And so the other thing is, as I think through and just looking at how do the ultra 9-figure and plus, net worth entrepreneurs handle this, there's definitely separate property trusts and entity structuring that's combined with the prenup. So that's kind of the planning that's done on the front end. And then it's important post-marriage to document the separate property trust maintenance, not commingling. I think that's very important. And then also even, incorporate within the operating agreement, different first right of refusals or ROFRs, transfer restrictions, just making sure that you kind of have the extra layers of defense just in case the prenup, just in case the property trusts are pierced. You have then also these governing legal documents as kind of a last line of defense. So we do have a chart here that just kind of talks through the Billionaire approach of how to layer these different strategies that we'll throw up for others to see. So speaking of layer strategies, let's talk through an actual case study here. So know an entrepreneur here, $50 million is the net worth. And kind of what they did was they kind of did this. I shouldn't say kind of, they did do this. Now, it was really also an estate tax play, state tax mitigation play, and then also a income tax mitigation play. So this entrepreneur is in mid 40s, about $50 million net worth. On his a second marriage. The second marriage was done probably within a month of the divorce getting finalized. Since those divorces take a long time, especially if they're not clean. He didn't want to have the prenup conversation. So what was done instead, he was telling me about, is he was based in Kentucky, which is a 4% income tax state. They sold assets to a Nevada trust. And so the idea was that all of the growth of these assets is now outside of the taxable estate, because if he passed away with over $15 million in 2026, all of that growth is subject to taxes. Anything above $15 million is subject to 40% estate taxes at death. So sell the assets to a Nevada trust, and then also avoid the Kentucky 4% income taxes when there's some closely held business units that he was a minority investor and that he thought were going to pop off. So the idea here was that he doesn't own any of these assets. He's owed money from the trust because he sold all these assets into a trust. So that was what he did. I think maybe a prenup would have been a good first step conversation instead of all this planning. Now, it was estate planning and income tax planning too, but what are your thoughts on that kind of structure? And then also maybe the guise of estate tax mitigation and income tax mitigation, which is true, but also maybe omitting that this is also a prenup avoidance technique.
Yeah, well, I'm always a big fan of communication, even when it's difficult, and especially in the most intimate relationships, which would be between spouses. So I would never advocate that you should go with a plan where you don't have to tell your spouse the truth.
Yeah.
But in this particular situation with this person where he didn't want to have the conversation, wanted to protect his assets, this is a structure that would work in that way and also gives him asset protection and estate planning and some tax benefits. And for those reasons, I think, those are reasons to do all of that. I think this also dovetails into people with kids from a second marriage, because often I've seen in my career where one spouse dies who has kids and the other spouse survives, and then all of a sudden the kids are upset, the second spouse is upset. Like everyone, you create these family rifts where everyone's angry at each other and doesn't talk anymore. And again, that's where communication happens. And what a lot of times, let's say a man left his wife and they had kids together and then married someone else and then never wanted to have a conversation with the kids because he felt uncomfortable, and he never wanted to have a conversation with his second wife, and she just assumed everything goes to her. And then when he dies, everyone's angry.
Yeah.
And of course, the smart thing to do is when people are of age and they're mature, whether it's the kids or whatever, is to actually sit down with them and have real conversations about, here's how I look at it, here's how I think about this is my money, and this is the way it's going to flow. And if you have a problem with that, let's talk about that right now. And if you do that while the person's alive, you can mitigate a lot of these problems, because once someone dies, then each side thinks that the person who died would have wanted to take better care of them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, let's talk through the structure. One of the trusts that was set up here was what's called a NING, a Nevada Incomplete Non-Grantor Trust. And so that was what was used to specifically get around Kentucky's 4% income tax rate. The idea being some assets that were moved into that trust were minority interest in companies that were expected to have huge liquidity events, so not necessarily an operating business. And so the idea being that when those sold, the entrepreneur no longer held those. They were owned by this trust that was domiciled or based in Nevada. Nevada does not have a state income tax rate. So therefore, when there was a capital gain event, still pay your federal capital gain taxes, but you would avoid the 4% on the Kentucky side. So the projection was going to be over 6-figure tax savings just based off the valuation and the appreciation. So what are your thoughts on NINGs overall? And just as that was one of the kind of actual technical strategies this entrepreneur used.
They're complicated. You obviously want to have good counsel on that, but they can be really effective just for the reasons that you said. And I've seen entrepreneurs take stock from a company that's growing fast, put it in a NING so that some future date when that company sells, just like you said, you can avoid the taxes. New York actually passed a law to eliminate the ability to do NINGs. California, you can still do them. California is very aggressive in their attacking them. So the longer you have, as we like to say, those trusts to marinate, the longer time you have that those trusts are in existence, the more likely you're not going to have a problem. But, a lot of states have state income tax and capital gains tax, and this can be an effective way. And not only that, asset protection, as well as estate planning. And I've seen entrepreneurs use the proceeds to create almost like a family bank.
Right.
That can be used to loan money at good rates to the kids and grandkids, and also teach financial responsibility without all the things that you have to do when you go through a regular bank.
Yeah. Yep. And I think kind of transitioning back to the prenup and the whole conversation about marriage, the question would be is if there were issues in this marriage, would the new spouse argue that there was concealment of premarital assets, which could you kind of null and void this, or even make an argument there's a fraudulent transfer and the court could maybe hold them in contempt. So it'd be interesting to see even like legally, which is outside of my bailiwick here, is how legitimate the structure could actually be if there were issues within the marriage, ahead of this whole structure getting wound down. But I do think that the argument from the attorney is that this is an estate and income tax, mitigation strategy more so than a.
Yeah. And if it's truly that, why not do it as soon as that benefits you and not wait till you're about to get married?
Yeah.
And when I think the bottom line from all of this is make sure you marry the right person, make sure there's a lot of communication.
Yep.
And I think it was your dad, if I could share that, your dad gave you a couple bits of advice for your life.
Mm-hmm.
What were those?
Yeah, I remember it was like an article, I think that was published in like the late 80s, early 90s, and he like had it cut out. And whenever we would graduate from college, he would give it a copy to each of me and my sisters. And it was like, essentially said there's two decisions that if you get right in your life, you will be happy. The first decision is going to be your career. And so essentially you're going to spend, half of your waking hours in your career. So getting that decision right is so critical. Second, the biggest decision is your spouse. So he pretty much is like, if you marry right and you choose your right profession, you're going to have like 80% of your life has been figured out. And I think it's really true because one house, one spouse, that's another great financial saying that I love to say. But I do kind of back to that comment. I think that getting into the right career and choosing to marry the right person is definitely the most important.
Yeah, and I think you and I did very well in that space. Now, Leanne and Mimi, I'm not sure they would agree that their decisions were best. But yeah, I mean, that's, as much as that sounds cliche, really marrying the right person is so important. And it's also why when you marry young like we did, or like you did, when you have nothing, it makes the whole thing much easier. You still want to marry the right person.
Yeah.
But there's not all this complexity. But the reality is there is that complexity. And that's why earlier in the podcast I said, have that conversation early in a relationship. See where you stand and how you can figure that out together rather than waiting until you feel like you can't bring it up.
Yeah, and I think there's it'd be interesting to see if there's a correlation between wealth and divorce rates, because I do think that as I look to the ultra, high, the Bezos, the Gates, marriages tend to fall apart there. I mean, I think there's some exceptions to that rule, like Zuckerberg, but even Buffett had a lot of marital problems. And so I think it's interesting that if ambition and I think maybe distraction and not being mentally present in the marriage is probably what I would guess is like kind of a byproduct of maybe someone building a business. Elon Musk, right? Huge marital issues, been married several times.
Yeah. I think the best indication or the best story I can think of is Jack Welch, who was the famous CEO of General Electric and took them through the most incredible years and wrote a book called From the Gut. And yet, as smart as he was and as much as he did, he got divorced. And when he got divorced, it cost him something like $500 million, about half his net worth. And I just thought, if he would have been a little more focused on the relationship, maybe he would have had a better life and a better net worth. Yeah. They both can work out for you if you're paying attention, not just to the business, but also to your home life.
Yeah.